It's time to translate the science, data, and research behind dairy cattle genetics into real world applications for farmers around the globe. Brought to you by the Council on Dairy Cattle Breeding, the CDCB CowCast begins now. Welcome back, everyone, for our August edition of the CDCB CowCast. We are now 1 week past the evaluation release date for a very monumental proof run. So, to help us walk through what we saw last week, what we've learned, what happened, we have two special guests joining us for this episode. To start us off, we have Ezequiel Nicolazzi, who is our Chief Operating Officer at CDCB. And next up, we will have Taylor McWhorter back, joining us to recap what we learned about those reproductive performance traits. But first off, Ezequiel, huge evaluation run we just wrapped up with. Feels good to have it done. You're taking a big sigh of relief. What what do we know about the data that was used? What informed these new numbers?
Thank you, Katie. First of all, welcome everyone. Yeah, this was quite a big evaluation. Lots of changes, a lot of excitement. In terms of phenotypic data, we usually group them in trait groups because obviously each trait group has its own set of data, and they are very diverse. There are some trait groups with a lot of data, some of them with little data. So the trait group that usually has the largest number of phenotypes is cow livability. We have about 132 million. The second largest is, again, obviously lactation data that includes milk, fat, and protein. And also somatic cells has a quite substantial number. They are both around 110 million records. The fourth biggest one is calving ease with 41 million. We do have health traits with 14.5 million. And then we go lower and lower with calf health traits, which were recently introduced. They went quite drastically high in the number of phenotypes. We started the evaluation with, actually the research phase with barely a million or two of records, and now we are around 8. And then obviously the non-Holstein type traits are the let's say the last group with many million records, which I think they are around 4 million. And the last two are the newest traits, one of the newest traits or the more expensive traits to collect. So milking speed, which was introduced recently, has around 207,000 lactations being used. And the one that is really expensive to collect is residual feed intake with over 12,200 records. So yeah, that's an overview of the records that we're currently using.
What's the reason why we saw that calf health record group grow so much between the research phase of that like 6 to 700,000 or a million records to 7 million now?
That's pretty normal, and we do expect in the next few runs to have that happen even more. So when we start the research, we start with usually we collaborate with one or more of our data providers that send us all of the historical records that they do have, and we do all the evaluation, all the estimation of the parameters that we need to calculate the evaluations using that. And then when we start the evaluation or we get ready to start an evaluation, we do get essentially all of the data from those providers, but also the other providers. That is the normal evolution of things. We did see that very similar situation with health traits when we introduced them. We only had about I don't remember if it was less than 5 million or 2 million. It was very little compared to now, and we are now almost at 15 million. So it does make sense. Obviously, producers get to know the traits. They get excited about the traits. They understand the usefulness of the traits, so they contributed with the data. And more data we have, more accurate we can be in our prediction. So that's a pretty normal scenario. So hopefully this trait will grow a little bit more.
And these really large numbers that we have for those phenotypic groups of the over 100 million, right? Or 130 million, even in some cases. How far back does that data span that quantity can be so vast when there's only 9.6 million cows in the US today?
Yeah. So Well, obviously, when we talk about trait groups, there's a lot of variability because some of the traits are very old. They have been measured since the beginning, and some of them are relatively recent. So if you consider fertility, there's some traits like DPR that has data back to 1960. And then there's some traits like cow consumption rate that only started around the 2000s. So when we consider the entire group, we are mentioning the total amount, but obviously not all the traits are done equal. Usually, the largest groups like lactation data or cow livability, they go back to the 60s.
And obviously, like our new data type is our genotypes, which we haven't talked about yet. So, Ezequiel, what do we know about the number of animals that received genetic evaluations last week, both on the phenotypic side for like traditional evaluations, as well as on that genotypic side with genomic evaluations?
So in terms of phenotypic evaluation, which is the first one that we calculate, so those are the first statistics that we get immediately. The number of animals that receive an evaluation this run were around 95 million animals. That's a growth of about 2 million animals compared to April, so in 4 months. Most of them are obviously female, so 94 out of the total is million animals obviously is females, then around 800,000 is males. Plus, we obviously need to account for all of the interaction with the international partners. In terms of genotypes, that was a quite drastic increase. That this is a record run on that sense. We went to over 11 million, almost 12 million animals receiving a genomic evaluation, and compared to the April run, that was the record. We are talking about over 700,000 animals receiving a genomic evaluation since April. And that was kind of expected. We did expect a big run because we have been getting pretty consistently weekly evaluations that include only new animals of about 50,000 animals every week for the past months. But yeah, when you see that number, that is pretty impressive and scary.
We've talked about last year, right? We hit that almost 2 million mark for the new genotypes that came into the database or animals genotyped. And now this year, it sounds like we're on track to really, I don't want to say shatter, but at least break it, record setting weekly evaluations. And Ezequiel, I'm going to take a step back here because weekly evaluations are maybe something that everyone's not familiar with. Can you explain how that is different from a full evaluation run that we just did here in August? Like, how does the weekly compare?
So weekly evaluations are a first glance on the genetic evaluations of an animal. So when we receive a genotype, the first week in which the animal is considered to be usable, that means that his genotype is okay, his all the information that we have about the animal, so parents and so on, is okay and is confirmed. We include that in a weekly evaluation, which is essentially a preview of the genetics of the animal, and we only include new animals that come to the system during that week. So when I was referring to 50,000 animals in a weekly, that means that we receive those 50,000 animals confirmed to 50,000 animals in a single week. And that usually gets released on every Tuesday. The difference with the monthly is that in the weekly, we just don't recalculate all of the SNP effects. We just use the most recent one. So there's a number of simplifications that happen during the weekly, and that's why it's considered as a preview and not as a full service, because there are some simplifications that we do in order to get those evaluations fast out of the door. The monthly includes all of the animals, and in a monthly, we do recalculate all of the solutions, including all of the animals. So we do all of the imputation on all of the animals, and then we release those evaluations. And since those use the full process, that's why we consider that as the most accurate process, and that's why there's a lot of other information that gets released during a monthly compared to a weekly. And just to give you an idea of how much it takes to get a weekly, it takes about a day. A monthly it takes about a week. So that's why the difference.
And those monthly evaluations are also different from the triannual evaluations where we have the new phenotypes too, correct? So we have really
That
like
is
three
correct. So
stages
yeah,
of these evaluations.
that is correct. The triannual is a lot more complex and actually takes about a month to be delivered. In the triennial, we also update the phenotypes, which are not updated during the off triennial monthlies, because we do also exchanges with Interval, which is an international entity that calculates genetic evaluations for traditional evaluations on all of the countries, and we use that information in the evaluation as well. So there's a lot of more complexity in a triennial evaluation compared to a monthly. Yeah.
Yeah, and we do like to use the term phenotype when we talk about genetic evaluations. For people who are listening or viewing this, not familiar with that term, it just means cow performance records. So we're looking at that true performance numbers, what the cow is doing, what the bull's daughters are doing, and that's what we're tracking with those phenotypes. Weekly evaluations are that really good snapshot to make management decisions. If you're genotyping your calves at a young age, you want to make those culling decisions early. You want to be able to group animals well. That is a snapshot you can have really quickly for those young animals. Well, speaking of young animals, Ezequiel, we're going to talk a little bit about these calf health traits because we now have two new traits for calf health: resistance to diarrhea and resistance to respiratory problems, now published for Holsteins and Jerseys. What can you tell us about the numbers that came out of the run for those two traits for those two breeds?
I have to say, Katie, that the information that went out for linked to the research was pretty accurate and pretty much on point with what we observed in this evaluation, even though the numbers grew quite drastically compared to the research, which is a great thing. The values of resistance to diarrhea are pretty much in line with what was reported. So we do expect values that range between, let's say, most of the population will be around plus and minus 4. We can see some animals that go a little bit over or a little bit lower on the scale that is expected. But yeah, that's the range that we do expect on Holsteins. On jerseys, the things are a little bit more spread out. So we may see values of animals that go up to 6 and -6. That's the range on most of the animals. Again, there may be some outliers there. And as for respiratory disease, we are talking about for Holsteins a range that goes between almost 5.5, let's say 6 plus or minus, and for jerseys it's about 7. So not too different there. So obviously these are PTAs, so they are centered to 0, around 0. So if you do the average, you see a 0.19, that's okay. That's not a problem. That's part of the game when you are dealing with so many million animals.
And the zero there is equivalent to what, Ezequiel? So, because that Holstein and Jersey number really isn't the same
Yeah,
thing.
yeah, that's correct. So the PTAs are to be interpreted essentially as the deviation from a breed average. So we obtain a breed average for that resistance, let's say for resistance to diarrhea or respiratory disease, and then that deviation is expected to be the percentage over or under that breed average. Obviously, breed averages for the different traits are different. So for Holstein, for example, in diarrhea, we do have a very different percentage of resistance, like the breed average is around 76 for diarrhea, and then it's about 88 for resistance to respiratory disease. Whereas in jerseys, the averages are more similar, around 82. One is 82.6 and the other is 82.9, but we are around that value in both of the traits.
And again, this is our first run at these traits, which means that they are not included in net merit yet, or in cheese merit, or fluid merit, or really probably any industry index at this point. So they are functioning kind of as their own little special thing right now. And that really gives us a chance to evaluate how that trait, or two traits in this case, function in a production environment when we talk about producing evaluations. So, Ezequiel, we do know now that there are a couple outliers in these traits. So, how do we improve those traits moving forward? And how can producers know they can trust what we have today already?
Yeah. So outliers are not nice to see, but they are kind of expected when you are introducing a trait and you have so many records more in an evaluation. Usually that happens when you essentially encounter things that during the research were not present or you couldn't see. It is quite normal when the progression of traits happened. Yet again, it did happen similarly to health, in which we started the evaluations with a simpler model because we didn't have so much data. And once we got a consistent amount of data, then we improved the model a little bit in order to account for certain things that were not accounted for before. In this case, that seems to be the case as well. We did see a couple of outliers, and those animals have a very similar situation in the sense that they seem to have a large number of daughters in a very small number of herds. That usually means that you need to account for that, and you can correct in order to avoid the abundance of effects accumulating in one single herd or in a few herds. So we identified that during the review of this run, and our research and development team is working on to understand if including an effect to essentially mitigate this is the solution, and if it's not, then to find an alternative solution. So it's pretty normal. Again, it's a probabilistic system, so we are talking about statistics here, and sometimes there are things that go a little bit over the expected, and we deal with it and we move on. We need to consider that this is part of the game, and that's also the reason why we don't include those traits in the merit immediately, because we do expect that from time to time something may not be quite perfect. But again, we are talking about two bulls deviating largely. We're considering 800,000 bulls right now, and millions of cows. It's not nice to see, but it's part of the game.
It's always good to give the R&D team something to work on. They always have opportunities to make traits better and to work on developing new traits and new tools. So, to send this back to the R&D team now it's in production to say, hey, let's just make it better, right? Like let's enhance and improve it from here. Now that we have something out the door. So Ezequiel, one last question for you here as we wrap up. We are taking a big sigh of relief now that this evaluation is complete, but what have been your big takeaways from this run now that it's kind of in the rear view?
Well, yeah, this was probably the largest number of changes that I personally was involved since I joined CDCB 10 years ago. So this was a pretty unique scenario that we had to handle, and actually the work that led to this release was started a few years ago. There were like 8 months of testing. There was a number of interactions with committees and groups that advise us in order to understand if the science is good, if the data is good, if the results look good, and et cetera, et cetera. So there was a lot of work behind it, and we are really happy that this is out of the door, that the results are as we expected, and then things went out correctly. But the big takeaway, I think it's a big shout out to the team that produced these evaluations. They were amazing. They just conducted this very complex evaluation. They gave it all, sometimes overnight, making sure that things were correct, because it's a very difficult run to check as well. When you change so many things, it's very difficult to make sure that those values that change so much are correct. So we did a lot of extra work to make sure that that was the case. It's a huge change for everyone, and we do understand that, not just for us. We understand that when things change, there's always a lot of anxiety, and that's pretty much normal. There's going to be questions about things for the next foreseeable months, and that is kind of expected, especially when you change something as big as fertility. Those performance traits were needing a big update, and that is the results of 2 years of research from Taylor. So that's a really good thing for us. But obviously changes things so much that people will have questions, and that's again expected. What I can tell you is that the evaluation went under a lot of scrutiny from both the academia and from the industry. There were a lot of test runs. There was a lot of looking at the data and a lot of discussion over the results as well. Again, we are in the size business. So we do expect from time to time things to not be as we expect them. And if that happens, we will deal with them. But so far, the results that we saw were pretty amazing. And then Taylor will talk about reproductive traits. So I don't want to steal her show, but this is the first time again for many, many years in which the variation between a run and the other one showed pretty stable results for all of fertility traits, which was quite impressive and quite nice to see finally. It's pretty good, but yeah, there's not so much time to relax because we are also working on already obviously working on a major transition to single step and all the modernization of the evaluation. So we are moving things to the side and not relaxing too much and then start working again.
Yeah, and single step will certainly be a topic that we cover on this show
Oh yeah.
in the coming months, probably thoroughly and in depth, so people understand what that means. We have teased it out a little bit because it is a constant vein of thought that happens in everything that we're doing at CDCB right now. So, more to come on single step and the modernization of evaluations. This is a great chance to say the industry meeting at World Dairy Expo that CDCB is hosting on September 30th will have a presentation on the topic, and it's a great chance to start to learn more about that initiative that is ongoing in the industry and at CDCB right now. So, Ezequiel, I'm sorry to hear you're not going to take a big break or a nice little vacation for getting through this run, but thanks for taking the time on the backside of this to sit down with us, walk us through what we saw, what we've learned, and we will let Taylor take over on our reproductive performance trait topic from here. So, thank you.
My pleasure.
Want more genetic evaluation updates and insight? Don't miss the 12th annual CDCB Industry Meeting to be held at World Dairy Expo in Madison, Wisconsin on Wednesday, September 30th, 2026 from 8 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. in the Tan Bar. As we celebrate 100 years of U.S. genetic evaluations, we will also look ahead to how the system will continue to evolve. Find more details and how to register for free at uscdcb.com.
On our second half of this episode, we mentioned we were going to invite Taylor McWhorter back to the CDCB CowCast to cover these changes in female reproductive performance traits. So, as promised, Taylor, welcome back to the show again.
Thank you for having me, Katie. I'm excited to be back.
Well, you are the perfect person to join us to rehash what we saw in August. Ezequiel walked us through some larger statistics from the run, what we saw in those calf health traits, and now it's time to really dive in on those reproductive performance traits. So let's start, Taylor, with a quick overview of those updates. What happened in the traits this month?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in our recent August evaluation, there were pretty significant updates, like you guys have already talked about, but also to the female reproductive performance evaluations. The common theme across all of these changes was modernization. So, these traits were originally developed under reproductive management systems that looked very different from what we see on farms today. So we updated both the data processing and the evaluation models to better reflect current reproductive management.
Perfect. And can you tell us a little bit more about the traits themselves?
So for DPR, our daughter pregnancy rate, one of the biggest changes was improving how we account for voluntary waiting period, rather than essentially assuming cows across different herds began breeding at a similar time. For our CCR and HCR, our cow conception rate and heifer conception rate, we improved how the individual insemination records are adjusted for their unique breeding environments before they contribute to the phenotype for those two traits. And then EFC, our other existing trait in the legacy system or early first calving, we moved it to its own single trait model. And of course, last but not least, we introduced FSC, or first service to conception. That was our new cow reproductive performance trait that measures the number of days from first insemination to conception, or rather the date of successful insemination is what we consider conception for that trait.
Yeah, and Taylor, was there anything that happened outside of the traits themselves that was changed for the August run?
We can say that we made broader data quality changes. So this was how our contemporary groups were edited within these traits. We looked at when daughter cow records began contributing to our young bulls evaluations. So there were a lot of individual changes, but they all supported that same goal, making sure our evaluations are accurately representing those genetic differences in reproductive performance under today's dairy management systems.
Yeah, and you did a great job of laying out what those 10 changes are when you were last on this show. So, viewers and listeners can go back and listen to that, dive into those details and changes. But now that we are past the run, we do have some final PTA values, and we know a little bit more about how those traits performed with the new edits, with the changes in the models. So, can you tell us about those changes in PTA values? What can we see, for example, in like DPR for Holsteins or for Jerseys?
So now that we have the official August results, we can see how these changes or updates translated into our published PTAs. For Holstein specifically, if we take a look at the middle 90% of bulls, that way we're not looking at the extreme minimums or maximums for some unique animals. DPR is roughly negative 1.7 to a positive 2.3 across the bull population. Now, when I say the bull population, I'm referring to those that have an AI status of either active, genomic, or foreign. But that's a really interesting differences within these statuses. So if we look at our genomic Holstein bulls, that's typically our younger bulls, right? They just have a genotype. They averaged at about zero point 0.7, a positive 0.7 DPR, while our active bulls were closer to about a positive 0.2. We saw something similar in our jerseys. Again, if we looked at that middle 90%, we saw for those Jersey bulls about a negative 1.9 to a positive 2.7. And we saw our genomic Jersey bulls average about a positive 0.6. So very close to those genomic Holstein bull average as well.
When we think about those PTAs for those specific groups, we do know that there is some difference between older bulls and younger bulls. So, can you tell us a little bit about what we're seeing in those two different age populations?
Yes. So this is actually one of the patterns we were expecting to see after our test results from the revised system. We knew that the revised system would actually better represent our current population of animals. So we know that there's been real genetic selection for our improved reproductive performance over time. Theoretically, in that case, a genetically younger animal should, on average, reflect some of that progress, right, if we're selecting on it. Now, under the legacy system, we had this unusual pattern where our young genomic bulls often started relatively high and then tended to decline as our daughter information entered the evaluations, but still lower than our older historic populations. Now, some of that was because management changes over time weren't being fully separated from genetics, and some of that was related to which daughter records became available first for these young bulls. But with all this revised methodology, we're now better accounting for those effects. So part of what we're seeing is a clear separation between generations, right? Our younger bulls are reflecting the more recent genetic progress, while our older bulls are being evaluated relative to that updated picture of the population. In other words, I wouldn't say to interpret that as young bulls suddenly becoming genetically better in August or older bulls suddenly becoming worse. No, their biology hasn't changed. What we've changed is the way we're measuring those genetic differences. And you'll see that in the genetic trends as well.
That's a great thing to understand. And do we see that across the breeds, across all 4 or 5 traits as well, or is it more prominent in DPR or in a specific breed?
What we saw in the changes in our genetic trends were specifically to DPR and CCR, and that's because those two traits had a historic population that tended to have much higher PTAs. It looked like we were decreasing over time despite selection. Whereas with our HCR and EFC, our heifer traits, we saw a more expected trend in the legacy system. So with the revised system, basically all we saw was a change in the genetic trend for DPR and CCR. And we see our historic population have lower averages before selection occurred, and then a slight increase after selection started for these two traits.
Okay. And for CCR, for Holsteins and Jerseys, what do those ranges look like if we kind of shift a little bit towards that?
Yeah, so for CCR, specifically Holsteins, we can look at that middle 90% again for bulls. Let's look specifically at the bulls with our AI status of active, genomic, or foreign. They're going to fall roughly between a negative 2.0 and a positive 4.1 CCR. And again, our genomic bulls, our younger bulls, are shifted towards the higher end of that distribution, and they average around a 1.8 CCR. For the jerseys, the middle 90% has a similar range, but we're actually looking at a negative 2.9 to a positive 3.7, with those genomic jersey bulls averaging about a positive 0.8.
And if we last trait to kind of cover here, FSC, you did a nice job of overviewing what that trait is and what it means. But what do we see in terms of ranges for FSC?
Yeah, it's great to look at FSC because August is the first time we're publishing this trait. Of course, we've shown in a lot of our resources, we've had a lot of tests to compare all our values to, but these are the first available published official PTAs. So for our Holstein bulls with the same AI statuses, looking at that 90% in the middle again, we see an FSC of a negative 5.6 to a positive 11.9. And we see genomic Holstein bulls average about a positive 5.1, while our active bulls average closer to a positive 2.5. Now, before I get into jerseys, I want to acknowledge that these values do sound much bigger than DPR, CCR, and HCR. They are, and that's because they're looking at completely different units. So those other traits are talking about percentage changes, whereas FSC PTA is expressed in days. But it's still a positive value is favorable, just like our other traits.
And for the jerseys, what are we seeing on that side?
Yeah, for jerseys, the middle 90% is ranging about a negative 7.8 to a positive 11.3. And we see those young genomic jerseys bulls average about a positive 2.3 days, very similar to more of what we see in the active Holstein bull values. Again, it's really important to note we can't directly compare breed PTAs to each other. So we can't look at these Holstein PTAs and compare them to the Jersey PTAs because they're both on different breed bases. And the breed bases are also available for you to check out online or in our supplemental materials. That'll help you. Just remember you can't compare cross breeds for PTAs.
Yes, yeah, the 0 point is different for each of our breeds. And I appreciate, Taylor, the reminder that we are measuring in days for first service to conception. And I think it's also a good reminder that with this new trait, positive is favorable, and that translates to fewer days from first service to conception. So it's a little bit of an inverse flip, but we want to make sure that positive is the favorable side of the PTA we're selecting for.
Mhm.
So we spend a lot of time, Taylor, talking about bulls, and that's a population we've really focused on leading up to these changes and what we're going to see getting ready for that run last week. But if we think about the female side too, what can you tell us about how the female population looks like and maybe help farmers level set where their cows or their herd lands within the broader population?
So our bulls are only half of the genetic picture, right? And our producers can use these same evaluations to understand where their females rank as well. So one way to put an individual cow's PTA into context is to compare her with her other cohort, if you will. So what we're looking at is a distribution of cow PTAs for FFC, specifically our Holstein young females born 2020 or more recent that are genotyped. And this helps us visualize, based on her PTA, what percentile does she fall into? So we see a median about 2 days for FSC. That's right around the middle of this population. Now we can look at the same percentile distribution for all of our reproductive performance traits in all breeds because they're all going to be a little bit different. So you can put your individual females' PTAs into context, and these are going to be published on our website, so you can take a look.
Yeah, that's a great resource, Taylor. And what a wonderful way to see our female population depicted. And if we think about um, the next part of this, Taylor, really moving beyond the PTAs of the bulls and the cows, and we think about the genetic trends, I think that's the other part that we do want to talk to you about on this episode because the genetic trends have also changed. So, what can you tell us about the genetic trends for, let's say, DPR with these changes that have occurred in the past week?
We can definitely take a look at those genetic trends from the official August evaluation. Let's start with DPR. I'd also like to point out all the trends for all these traits by breed can be found on one of our websites. That's going to be webconnect.uscdcb.com. That's webconnect.uscdcb.com. And you can check out all the genetic trends. Now, what you'll notice on each of these by trait, the x-axis on the bottom here is going to go all the way back to when we first have phenotypic information for a trait. So you're going to see a much wider range for DPR compared to CCR and FSC. And DPR gives us this longest historical picture. So historically, we saw reproductive performance declining genetically for several decades and reaching its lowest point around the late 1990s. This is expected because when we were selecting primarily on yield traits, not really also selecting on reproductive performance, we saw this decline occur. Now, the direction changed pretty drastically when the DPR evaluation was first published in 2003. And later in that same year, it was added to one of the merit indexes. So you can see once we could start selecting on this trait, we have a gradual increase in our genetic trend. CCR is telling us a very similar modern story. So again, we have that x-axis to go as far back as we have phenotypes for the early 2000s. And there's been a really clear upward genetic trend in conception rate. Now this makes sense. It has that strong correlation with DPR, as well as the implementation for CCR was in 2009, and its later inclusion into the merit indexes in 2014. And I really just think this is what's especially reassuring with how consistent the story is across these two traits. They're measuring different components of reproductive performance, but all their genetic trends show substantial genetic progress in more recent generations, as we would expect when we are making selection choices on these traits. And you can see this in both our sires and our cows. You'll notice the absolute levels differ between those two populations, but the direction of genetic progress is very similar.
Yeah, and Taylor, I think the other thing just to point out for people who are looking at these charts with us in real time is that the y-axis is in our EBVs or estimated breeding values. How does that differ from a PTA that people might be more familiar with seeing?
Thank you for pointing this out, Katie. That's a huge component here. So our EBVs, or estimated breeding value, is equivalent to 2 times your PTA. So if you want to see what the PTA is, you just take this y-axis and divide it by 2.
That's perfect. And you mentioned already, right? You can find these charts, you can find the genetic trends for any of the traits that are published by CDCB in Web Connect. So you can either go to that webconnect.uscdcb.com or you can access it just through the uscdcb.com website. Just look for Web Connect. And I think, Taylor, maybe the other thing that's in there that we had talked about before we hit record for this episode in Web Connect, you can also find those top animal listings. What else can people find in terms of resources that might help them understand what's going on? How do their animals fit into the bigger industry picture now, or when they're trying to make those breeding selections?
Absolutely. There's a number of resources you can find on WebConnect, starting with individual animal queries. So you can access your individual animals. You can not only look at their evaluations, but you can also check their evaluation history to see the consistency from one run to the next. You can also take a look at the top animal listing, like you mentioned, that can be sorted by trait, by breed, and by sex, our bulls or our cows. You can take a look at these genetic trends like we've discussed. You can also access those breed means by trait, so you can figure out what a PTA of 0 is equivalent to in your specific breed. We can also see different statistics on our bulls, comparing these bulls across our AI evaluations. And additionally, not just trait related, you can check things out like our genotype counts by year. So it's a really great resource. I'd also like to plug for the National Performance Metrics. This is relevant to reproductive performance. So you're not going to find evaluation or trait-based phenotypes or PTAs, but you can take a look at where some of the phenotypic data comes from and summarizes a lot of data that we have incoming. If you go to the National Performance Metrics, you can take a look at a lot of summary statistics for our reproductive performance information.
That's great, Taylor. And as we kind of wrap this all up to end our episode, is there anything else that listeners and viewers should know or be aware of now that this change, monumental change truly, to these existing traits and the new FSC trait are available? Anything else that they should know or be aware of?
I think it's really important to be familiar with the new ranges of the trait PTAs. You might have seen your individual bulls or cows PTAs change, potentially increase or decrease. But I just want to note that the entire population has shifted. Now, not in a single direction, it's been rescaled. So if you are concerned about the PTA value change, I strongly advise you to take a look at the top animal listings or compare to these percentile tables to see where your animal falls in relation to the population.
That's a great reminder. And now that we've shocked the system in August, December will feel a little bit more mellow because it's not going to be all these big changes again. The trait's just going to do what the traits will do with the new phenotypic information that will be added, correct?
Yes, that's correct, Katie.
Okay, we love some stability in our evaluations. Taylor, thank you again for joining us for another episode and being a part of this. And congratulations, honestly, to you and the team for getting this from start to finish and seeing these modern female reproductive performance traits roll out to producers and to the industry at large. Excited to see what people can do with this enhanced information. So thank you for joining us. And to our listeners, we'll catch you next time.
Thank you very much, Katie.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the CDCB CowCast. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe wherever you are streaming. Questions or comments about the topic covered in this episode can be sent to outreach@uscdcb.com. That's outreach@uscdcb.com. Or you can send us a message at the Council on Dairy Cattle Breeding on Facebook and LinkedIn. We look forward to hearing from you and see you again next month.